I think it's time to start, so let me welcome you to the last in this lecture series. We're hoping that this won't be so much of a lecture, or we don't intend it to be so much of a lecture tonight. We're going to have a panel discussion amongst the members of the lecture series presenters and also with you guys. And we do have some questions from you. We have some questions which we've posed to each other and to ourselves, and we'll just open it up for a free-for-all. And we think that with this group, it'll probably be pretty lively. And the last two announcements I need to make are thank you announcements. And I think first I'm going to say thank you to Ken Thompson. I think we should give him a huge round of applause. Because Ken just kind of gets people together and we just sit around and chat and say what we'd like to have happen, and then Ken makes it happen. So that's the hard part. Thank you, Ken. And you can always depend on him. And another big, big thank you to the Alumni Association Lecture Series Committee, which includes Ann Boone, Kitty Robbins, and Don Hobby. You guys are all three here, right? Would you stand up so that we can give you a round of applause? Thank you very much. And these folks were the ones who came up with the idea of this series about 9 or so years ago and have been assembling people to work on it every year since then. So thanks a million. It's been a lot of fun, and I think we've all learned a lot. Well, for tonight, as I said, we have a panel discussion. All of us met, pardon me, all of us met yesterday just to kind of get our ducks in order and talk about what we might like to do tonight. And one of the things that came up as Gary and Dan and Ron and John and Paul and I chatted yesterday, is that really lecturing isn't what people do mostly in the ways of learning. There is a lecture series that goes along with it, but most of these classes, like most honors college classes, are very interactive, right? So if you were in a class, you wouldn't just have Ron or Gary or John standing up and lecturing at you for 50 minutes. It would be much more interactive than that. And so we thought that we would start out this evening with a little bit of an exercise, something like what at least a few people in this lineup mentioned that they would do with their classes at the beginning of the semester. So we have a question up here, or two questions up here on the whiteboard. We'd like for all of you to take just a couple of minutes. You might want to chat on, it's also called a dry erase board. Oh, you can't read. Okay, well. No one, okay, Anne can't, so she's probably not the only one. Okay, so here are the questions. And we're gonna ask you to, maybe chat among yourselves, because that's what we might do in a classroom, or just think for a couple of minutes about these two requests from us. Tell us one thing you know to be true, and tell us how you know it. One thing you know to be true, and how you know it. There aren't any wrong answers. The only wrong answer is no answer. Sorry. Okay, so just take a couple of minutes and think about that. And then my lovely and talented assistant, Paul Spruill, is going to put your answers up here on the board, and we'll have something to look at and talk about for a little bit. Okay, so just take a couple of minutes. When you have something to say, just put up your hand, and I don't think I'll run around with the mic. Just shout it out, all right? Yes, Maura.
The sun will rise a little after 7 tomorrow morning. That is the only thing I know for sure.
And how do you know it?
Because I read it in the paper today.
Okay, so that's important. The sun's coming up a little after 7.
Go.
I promise I won't say.
Take it away.
Okay, and she knows it because of the Missoulian, her source. All right, good. Who else? Who else has something? Yes, Sandra.
Very simple. I think I know that we are living
on a planet.
Okay?
And how do you
And
know?
thus, I got that from school,
From school.
elementary school.
Elementary school.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, okay, that we're living on a planet. Sandra knows that we're living on a planet, and she learned that in elementary school. Yes.
My dog's name is Steve. I know it because I gave it to him.
Okay, his dog's name is Steve, and he knows it because he said so, because he gave it to him. Okay, wonderful. Yes.
I know that there's a glacier in Glacier National Park named Sperry, and it is smaller today than it was 50 years ago today, or not today, but years ago, because I stood on it 50 years ago, and I stood on it last year, and where I stood on it last year is rock, which was glacier before.
So you know that there's a glacier named Sperry Glacier, and that it's becoming smaller, and it's markedly smaller than 50 years ago, and you know that because you've stood there. Okay, good.
I think.
He knows that he thinks, because I am. Because he is. Okay, lovely and intelligent assistant, find somewhere to put that. Okay. Yes.
Gravity works when one falls off a bike.
Gravity works, and you know that because you fell off a bike. Okay, what else? What else? Remember, the only wrong answer is no answer. What, does somebody else have something? Yeah.
People need friends.
People need friends, and how do you know it?
I have been a friend to others, and I've been befriended, and it's a joy and it's a comfort.
Okay,
It's a feeling
good.
of wholeness.
Okay, she's been a friend herself, and other people have been friends to her, and it's a joy and a comfort, and it gives you a feeling of hope, of wholeness. Okay, what else? Yes.
I don't believe there's such a thing as truth in the absolute, so I don't know anything.
She doesn't know anything.
Does she know
How
that
do
she?
you know you don't know
Yeah.
anything?
Because everything changes.
Because
True
everything
today may
changes.
not be true tomorrow.
So 2 + 2.
Okay. Yes, yes.
Oh, I don't know anything either, but I know I've had a heck of a good trip on this earth.
She knows she's had a heck of a good trip on this earth, and you know that because?
Because I'm still having fun.
Because she's still having fun. Okay, good. What else? Anybody else? Come on, John. John, you got to know something. Put him on the spot.
I said was, that's a hard question.
That's why we
How do
asked
you
this
know that?
class that. Right. How do you know it's a hard question?
Because I couldn't come up with a quick answer.
Way in the back.
Yeah, way in the back.
Someday I'm going to die
Someday you're going to die, and how do you know that?
because I have not observed any other human being living endlessly.
Okay.
I'm a human being.
Observation, that's the pattern. Okay, good one. Yes.
We've landed on the moon, and I know it from television.
But have we?
That's right. Unless they did it with cameras and mirrors or something, right? What else? Anybody else? Yes. Everybody has opinions, and how do you know that? Because they're always telling you their opinions. Okay.
I don't think I believe her.
That's right. In Paul's opinion, you're wrong. What else? Oh, yes.
I know some things that don't require either words or images to know.
Okay. And how do you know them?
I heard the Greek piano concerto last weekend.
Okay, all right. He knows that some things don't require words or images, and he knows that because he heard the concerto. Anything else? Yes.
President
Done.
Bush was irritated today.
And what was your first clue? No. And how did you know that,
I
Don?
watched CNN.
You watched CNN. Okay. Good.
Just
Anything else? Yes.
Airplanes stay up in the air.
Airplanes stay in the air. Okay? And how do you know it?
I was just on one.
She was just on one. People can fly. Okay, anything else? Yes.
I know that I am as
center of self-consciousness.
He is a center of self-consciousness. And how do you know that?
Just because I'm conscious of myself.
Okay, all right, good.
Circular.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes.
I am a mother of 3.
Uh-huh. You know that you're a mother of 3, and how do you know that?
I gave birth 3 times.
Giving birth to them.
I remember.
And even if you've forgotten that, you deal with them every day, huh, Sandy?
Crocuses are up, I saw them today.
Okay, she knows the crocuses are up because she saw them today. Anything else? Any more? Yeah.
I know there's an endless and sublime relationship between the notes and the Western musical scale.
He knows there's an endless and sublime relationship between the notes and the Western musical scale.
Because I practice it every day.
And that's because he practices it every day. Good. Okay, anybody else, quickly?
University of Montana is the greatest school in Montana.
And how do you know? Go Grizz, go Grizz. And how do you know that?
I went to school there and I lived here ever since.
There you go. Okay, and that's a good finish, right? Okay. Now, Paul, you might have noticed that he wasn't just writing these things all down in a line. Do you want to use this mic, or do you want to sit at the table to tell us what you're doing?
I want my colleagues to be able to bail.
Oh, yes, okay. Okay,
I'll sit down.
Okay.
I'm not a good sitter, but I'll try.
okay. Okay, so Paul's going to let us know why he arranged all of your responses in the way he did.
So I don't know if you, is this thing on?
It is, just lean forward a little bit.
Okay, so I don't know how much of it you can read. And we've talked quite a bit about the interaction among all of us. And I start my class, the very first class of my semester, with this little exercise that I really think I stole from Dan and Ron in one form or another. But if you look down the columns, and so I'll quickly remind you what are in the columns. On the leftmost, we have people who are thinking and knowing because they're thinking. Everyone has opinions. Center of consciousness. These are really ways of knowing that are emotional. They're not necessarily based on direct experience. They're not directly based on looking at something or perceiving it. They're intuitive and emotional and faith-based. We move on, and that starts with Gary. We're not actually in order, but it starts with Gary and Gary's talk to kick off our lecture series. The next series of things, glaciers are getting smaller because I have 2 points of reference. I perceived that things have changed from one point in time to the other. People need friends because my perception of what a friend is tells me that that's a good thing. We landed on the moon because we saw it on the TV. So these are things that we saw. That shifts into Ron's talk. And really the question, another question Ron considered was, do our perceptions deceive us sometimes? Maybe the moon landing was a hoax. Then there are a whole series of things that are based on our direct experiences. Note there's some flip-flop between exactly, these aren't mutually exclusive lists. But there are things that are based on direct experience. We've experienced a plane coming up or staying up, it didn't crash. And then finally, the last sort of way of knowing I like to talk about with my class is one that we really haven't talked a lot about. As I said that, it makes no sense. It sort of does. But it's language. And we can use language to express different views, and I guess I said we didn't talk much about it, and we actually talked a lot using language, trying to convey some way of knowing. We know somebody's dog is named Steve. And so for that person, if you just say, hey, Steve just ran across the yard, you're not going to envision some guy, you're going to envision the dog, right? Notes on the scale and math sort of fall into that language category as well. And so we span different ways of knowing, and we use all these sort of ways in knowing the divine and scientific ways of knowing. And so there's a lot of interplay there. But I like to start class this way because really there's nothing in class we do that people don't experience daily. And so we thought that would be a nice way to start the class to get you a little more involved in thinking about not just our 5 lectures that are really snippets of our class, but the theme of the entire class.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Oh, jump in there.
What do you want to?
I want to add something to that. And one of the things we talked about, the way it comes up quite often in class, is the fact that we disagree with each other. And one of the things we model with our students is sometimes friendly disagreement. And so it's fascinating for me to see how Paul did the classification of things there, because some of the things I agree with, but some of the things I would have classified differently. One of the ways it comes up a lot with my students, and I do a similar exercise, although I have them write a paper about this, that I would have put a category up there is reliance on external authorities, reliance on trustworthy external authorities. I know this because my parents told me. I know this because the Bible says so. I know it because it's in the Missoulian, and that's a little scary that people put that much trust. But this notion that we have external sources of information that we consider to be trustworthy, but the point I think that Paul is trying to get at, that I think a lot of us are getting is one of the things that is, we use this as an invitation then to get into the material that we're using. For example, one of the really fun things, we didn't talk too much in this direct series here, but we read Freud. And we read Freud try to look at how much our unconscious is not available to us, our conscious realm. And so we think we're responding to our conscious, the conscious realm, when a lot of psychology shows us there's a whole realm of the unconscious, the subconscious, that actually may be dictating how we're doing things. And so this notion on we appeal to experience. I know this because I consciously thought it. Well, what about the whole part of our unconscious that's in there, what Freud called the id, that may be governing different notions of that? And so what's fun about starting this way is it leads us an invitation into the different literature and the different ways of knowing that we encounter in the class there, and the students can reflect back on their own experience as part of it, as do we as well.
This brings up, you mentioned that there was one way of knowing that we hadn't really talked about too much, and that was language. John, I think you had another way of knowing, because one of the questions which came to us was, what are now that we know what our current ways of knowing are, what are likely to be our ways of knowing in the future? Will we have to know in different ways that we don't even imagine now? And are there ways of knowing that you haven't talked about in this series? And John works in literature a lot, so he thought he might like to talk about that. Am I right?
Yes, you are. I guess I better say that. I taught in the Ways of Knowing course for the first time last fall, and I was perplexed at first, probably like the students are, by the idea of ways of knowing. What are the ways of knowing? There are multiple. You got enough avenues for knowing, and maybe knowledge itself becomes kind of vague. So it's hard to answer these questions, really. How do we know? Almost anything we say we know can be challenged. Maybe the moon landing was staged. How do you prove or disprove a proposition like that? One way I started thinking about this course in relation to literature, though, we've said that we tend to organize the course around knowing the divine, knowing nature, knowing society, and knowing the self. Now, there might be other categories, but those are big, major ones. I think everybody will agree. But those are ways of knowing. So I was thinking about, well, what are the objects of knowing, or the fields, or the subjects for knowing? And just to get a kind of sense of order here, I borrowed from the poet William Blake, whom I think many of us teach in the course. Blake claims that mental reality is fourfold, and it's made up of the senses, the emotions, reason, and the imagination. He claims furthermore, in a healthy, balanced mind, all these things are working together and interpenetrate each other, and that we get inefficient and sometimes dangerous when a particular component becomes excessive. The psychologist Carl Jung in the 20th century came up with this very same fourfold division, I think, independently. So maybe we could think of those as the actual ways of knowing, and the divine, nature, society, and the self as the objects or the fields of knowing, and that might lend a degree of clarity. In regard to literature, then, it seems to me, through the selection and the structuring of language, that literature preeminently uses all four of these ways of knowing, and therefore can provide an especially rich experience. We know the everyday world, of course, through these same ways of knowing. The everyday world becomes quite everyday, though, and we have habitual responses. So I think one thing literature does is to involve us in whatever it is that's going on through language there in imaginative literature. But it also separates us a little bit and gives us a kind of new experience for exercising our ways of knowing. Furthermore, and somewhat similarly, we get drawn into the experiences of people that are like us in many ways, because we all share human nature. There are universal human experiences that we all understand, but also the experiences and the characters that we encounter in literature also tend to be different. And so I think that provokes new ways for ways of knowing to operate, and it gives us a different experience and a different orientation than what we get in just our everyday lives. So it's taken me, a year to kind of work out ways of knowing. The course is a challenge. Students come in their ways of knowing, what's that about? And then we're reading all these different types of literature, all these different thinkers, philosophers, political scientists, psychologists, creative writers. We read The Tempest by Shakespeare, for instance. And so part of the challenge is for students to understand their own ways of knowing, to be challenged, to be engaged in critical thinking, which is what we like to do at a university, to play off of what other people have said in their writings and what other students say in classes. And I guess as an article of faith, I would hope that sometimes leads to a kind of clarity as well as entertainment in this course.
Any other comments from any of you guys about other ways of knowing that we may not have talked about or tried to represent in this lecture series? Gary, go ahead.
I sometimes feel conflicts between ways of knowing, and I'll tell a little story that illustrates that. One fall I was fishing the Big Hole River and caught a brown trout, and you might think I'm lying, that was, 3.5 pounds or so, and it was a magnificent fish. And I pulled out of my vest my little digital camera as I slid this big fish up onto the bank. And the rational side of me wanted to record this fish digitally, its colors, its size, its gender, and so on. But the sympathetic side of me that identified with this other living creature trembled so that I absolutely could not photograph this fish. And so my little camera kept saying, this picture is blurred, do you want to keep it, and so on.
Don't you hate it when your camera talks to you?
Oh, I know. And so the rational and the sympathetic sides of me were in conflict. And I think that's one of the other exciting things about this, to begin to recognize the way that the different ways of knowing sometimes contest with each other.
What about, we've tried to do this in sort of an orderly way with various, sort of, if it's this Tuesday, it must be scientific way of knowing or something like that. For students, or for all of us as students, how do you folks see all of these ways of knowing working together? I mean, does a person kind of grab a way of knowing and say, this is how I'm going to live my life? Or do you have in some way to be able to deal in all of these ways of knowing? Or what is it that helps us now that we know all of these ways of knowing? What kind of use are we supposed to make of that? Come up with something good now so that people don't think they wasted their time.
I would just say the more the better.
The more the better. Yes. Dan, do you have something?
Well, I wanted to reflect off something that came up in our conversation yesterday about this, and it's actually an area of concern for me, that as ways of knowing become more specialized, even though I think we're better when we're balanced in them, increasingly so many of them become so specialized that you have to be a specialist in science, or you have to be a specialist in religious ways of knowing, or you have to be a specialist as a philosopher in order to increasingly get access to that. So I was really struck because when John Glendenning was talking about Darwin, when you read Darwin, one of the preeminent scientists of the 19th century, it's beautiful prose. We read some selections, it's just spectacular. you'd be very hard-pressed to find that kind of writing acceptable in a scientific journal today. So what was preeminent science 150 years ago today would largely be precluded from being at least science that other scientists would recognize. Now, we have wonderful science writers who translate that to the masses of the rest of us. But increasingly, there's specialization of ways of knowing, I think, is a trend that's of concern. We were talking about how it's very, very difficult, even in your own discipline, your own field, to know it all anymore. You can't. You simply can't. And so what are the ways that we, as we move towards greater and greater specialization, also try to increase the access? And part of what we're trying to do in a course Ways of Knowing, we know the students aren't going to come out as philosophers and trained scientists and literary critics, but we want them to at least immerse themselves enough in the different kind of the way that the mode of thinking is, that they can recognize it and develop it in themselves to get this more integrated approach on that. But I know, Paul, we were talking about that a little bit in terms of the science stuff, and John, and I don't know if either of you have any thoughts, or Ron, philosophy or biblical stuff.
Well, Linda asked about what do I expect the students to come away from this course with in terms of these distinctive ways of knowing. Let me pick up on a couple of comments that were made. First of all, the reference to Blake and the 4 distinctive ways of knowing. And then Gary's talking about the scientific and the sympathetic ways of knowing. I think one of the things that I feel it's important for students to understand is when it's inappropriate to apply one way of knowing to another range of experience. I guess perhaps the most controversial example of that today is the whole creative design movement that we heard about last night, if any of you attended the presidential lecture. The attempt to somehow provide scientific evidence for creationism and present creationism as a science, I think is inappropriate. Picking up on something that Gary was talking about, I mentioned yesterday in our discussion, Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, who said the heart has reasons that reason cannot know, making a very clear demarcation then between 2 ranges of experience. I want to come back to that later when I get to this question about what reason, what we mean by reason. But I think it's to encourage them not to make, or discourage them from making category mistakes without prioritizing necessarily one way of knowing over another way of knowing, but recognizing that there are distinctive regions of experience that should be kept distinct, and each of them calls for a particular approach and a particular response, a particular way of knowing. It seems to me, rather than simply lay out the 4 or 5 distinctive ways of knowing, establish some boundaries. Now, it's difficult to maintain those at all times. I could go on and talk about how we have turned the Enlightenment, and I'm going to talk about that a little later, I hope, the Enlightenment age and the Enlightenment celebration of reason into a mythology, or it became a mythology. And there you have the interweaving, or the overlapping of the mythological and the philosophical way of knowing that I talked about in my first session. That occurs over time. So it's not always easy to make those boundaries, to establish those boundaries and hold to those boundaries. But I think it's important to recognize that they're there and observe when you're crossing over them and when one is lapsing into the other, shadowing and shading into the other.
So we might want our students, or we might ourselves want to come to understand which kinds of questions we can ask of which way of knowing, or which way of knowing we need to apply if we're asking a
Right.
particular kind of question.
Correct.
Rather than mixing the categories.
I don't entirely agree.
Okay.
We
Good.
agreed that
Go
we're
for
going
it.
to, we agreed we're going to disagree a little bit tonight, as we would in a classroom. I think largely you're absolutely right, that's dangerous, but it can also be dangerous to apply just one way of knowing. I'm thinking, for instance, of a scientist who's a pure rationalist and lacks sympathy and lacks imagination, and we all know the danger of that kind of science. We've seen a lot of that. So I think you're essentially right. I wouldn't want to push it too far. I think there are areas where it becomes counterproductive, if not outright dangerous, to not apply multiple ways of knowing.
Anybody else have anything on that? Why don't we go on to one of the questions which came across our desk, which is not addressed to any particular speaker, but talks about reason. Most of the speakers referred to the use of reason one or more times in their presentations. From my schooling in the physical sciences, I have a decent grasp of the scientific method and the meaning of logic. I am now struggling to understand what is meant by using reason. More specifically, I would like a nice definition explaining reason as a word and a process. So if we say the heart has reasons that reason can't fathom, what do we mean by that?
It's a wonderful question, because the very tail end of that question, how is it phrased? A nice definition, reason as a word and a process. And what that reflects is the sense that reason is both a noun and a verb. And I think we are duty-bound here to try to provide some definition. So let me take a stab at it. First is a verb describing a process. I would say thoughtful reflection. Reason is thoughtful reflection on a particular aspect of the human experience or a particular region of the human experience. And I think the only way I can follow up on that and clarify it is to give some examples. If we're taking our experience of the natural world as a subject for rational inquiry, we begin reflecting upon the natural world, and we begin drawing distinctions between the world of artifice, the world of human creation, which is artificial, and the natural world. And then we go on to reflect about that a bit more, not just me, but Aristotle and everybody that's thought about this that I know of. As they reflect upon that, they think about they conclude that the natural world has a kind of independent status, independent of our agency, as opposed to the world of artifice and the world of human construction. And then the question, all right, if it's independent, does it follow laws of its own structure? Is it a structured world? Is there a law-like nature? Is there a law-like character to nature? And then we begin reflecting more about that and what those laws might look like, what are natural laws, and how do we establish evidence for that. So that would be taking one aspect of human experience, namely the experience of the natural world, and subjecting it to rational inquiry. If we take another aspect of the human experience, let's say the moral life, and we begin reflecting upon what morality entails. And we might begin by observing that morality refers to human behavior that follows a certain set of standards, standardized behavior. But is that sufficient? No, it's not sufficient. Because moral behavior involves, as opposed to the natural world, human agency. And if we're talking about human agency, then what kind of agency is that? What does that invoke? Well, a moral act is a free act. So we conclude that the moral life is a life that has, as a way that is distinguished by the presence of free will. Thus, we hold individuals responsible for their actions. Now, we're still reflecting about the moral life. What we're trying to do then in terms of rationality or reason as a process is to, A, identify a particular concern of ours, an aspect of the human experience, and then try to understand what makes that distinctive. If we go back to the Greeks and Plato and Aristotle, they want to say that what makes that distinctive is its nature. Philosophy today has pretty much abandoned the idea that we can identify the essence or the nature of a particular feature of experience. but has not altogether abandoned the concern to identify what is distinctive about a particular aspect of experience. Al Borgman of our faculty has just written a book about ethics. And what he's doing in that book is trying to identify and talk about what is distinctive about the moral life. And then he lays that out there for others to look at, to question, to respond to, and so on. Now, that's reason as a verb. That's the process. But it's also a noun. It refers to the capacity to do that, the capacity to engage in thoughtful inquiry and investigation into a particular aspect of human experience. What happened with the Enlightenment, and I mentioned Descartes in my talk, what happened in the Enlightenment is that that particular singular capacity was elevated to a place where it became the exclusive and definitive capacity of what it is to be human, with the assumption that all other ways of knowing were then relegated to the realm of superstition, dogma, and so on, devalued. And that model persisted from the 16th, 17th century, well into the 20th century. Many things happened in the 20th century, one of the most dramatic being the rise of fascism in Germany, the country which had proclaimed itself through philosophers such as Hegel and Kant as the inheritors of that classical philosophical tradition. And then all of a sudden that other aspect of humanity burst forth. Freud talks about it at the very end of the work that we use in Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents. He's haunted by, in 1932 and 1933, the rise of fascism. And he recognizes that reason is not supreme. As Dan mentioned, he recognizes that there are other features of our psyche, if you will, sub-rational, irrational, that are not to be eclipsed by the rise and triumph of reason. But reason then as a noun refers to that capacity. The question is, getting back to what John was saying with Blake, the danger of making one particular aspect of knowing, one particular way of knowing supreme, and denying the existence of the others, because the others don't go away. They persist, and they need to be recognized and in their proper realm, and again, I'll disagree a bit with John here, celebrated within their own distinctive place in human experience. So reason is both a verb and a noun. Is a wonderful question. I've tried to make some response to it. Thoughtful deliberation about a feature of human experience and what is distinctive about that aspect of experience, whether it's the experience of nature, science being the proper response there perhaps, whether it's the experience of community, morality, and so on. And we have all of these divisions now in philosophy, the philosophy of science, ethics, metaphysics, and on and on and on, philosophy of history, and so on. No, that's enough, perhaps.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks. There's an associated question here, which I might want to throw in just now for anybody to comment on. And this question goes like this. It appears to me that objectivity leads to the truth, and that it's the truth that moves the world forward. How does objectivity flow across the various ways of knowing? Dan, you want to? Your mouth was hanging open, so I just thought that maybe something was going to come out.
I'm still thinking of Ron's question, but I'll take a stab.
Let's just move forward, right?
But also, I hope we'll have a chance to see if people
Sure.
want to contribute from the
Sure.
audience too, because I'm seeing lots of, it looks like thoughts moving on there. This is a way to maybe bridge from the question of reasons to objectivity, and I'm really thinking out loud here because it's the first time that I've been thinking about this approach here. But I'm wondering, in terms of the reason as a noun thing, one of the things that we try to do with our students is we were talking about this, that one of the things that characterizes, it seems increasingly, our generation of students is kind of a relativism. That people simply say, well, that's what I believe and that's what you believe, and let's just leave it like that. And John was, in our discussion, is saying, well, one of the differences is this is what I believe and here are the reasons that I have for it, and we can test those reasons to see are those good reasons or poor reasons. And so I was thinking about the realm of reason here. It is one of the ways that we move our way of knowing out of the individual experience into a community experience where we can communicate with each other. And we can say, here's what I think, or here's what I believe, and here are my reasons. Now, how do those reasons strike you? Is this make this accessible? Can we, and I even go back to the biblical thing, come let us reason together. But it's where we move it, knowing, into a communal activity, and then it moves it out of pure relativism that, you know, I have my opinion, you have your opinion, and that's, you know, just the same on that. What I was thinking about, I want to be fair to Paul, too, in this sort of scientific way of knowing here. I didn't want to be necessarily picking on, I mean, I do think there are good reasons that, you know, peer-reviewed science has particular standards that eliminate some ways of talking about experience and elevate others. What I get concerned about is we sometimes take the end product of a way of knowing, and we think that also represents the process of getting there. Let me see if I can back up and tell you what I think about that. I think science, and most scientists, if you took them, rely on all four of these things. They rely on their senses, they rely on their feelings, they rely on their imagination, and they rely on reasoning as part of the process of doing science. And Paul gave a really good example with, I'm blanking on the female scientist. Barbara McClintock, who was deeply intuitive in terms of her ways of knowing here. But when she finally produces her work, she has to make it accountable to a larger body, so then she has to give reasons for it. And simply saying, I have an intuition, isn't seen as sufficient within that. But intuition is very important for actually getting to the answer in that process there. So I want to see us expanding our ways of knowing to incorporate all those, even when the end product doesn't necessarily do it. And the other way I would say about it here is my training is in theology. I think one of the mistakes that oftentimes happens in the field of religion is we start with theology as the starting point, when theology really is the ending point of a long process that moves from religious experience to trying to make sense of it, to try to give reasons for it, to try to make it accountable and accessible to other people. And so it's the end of that process, but so oftentimes where, particularly religious communities that disagree with each other, they start with their conclusions, and you eliminate the whole process of how you got there. And it's the process, I think, that oftentimes makes it accessible to other people. When we ask them, how have you gotten to that point? And so part of what we're doing in Ways of Knowing, I think, is helping students to be thoughtful. When Ron talks about reasoning as a verb, training them in that process of being thoughtful and giving good reasons so we know where you ended up, but also how you got there. Now, that's a very long-winded way of sort of saying about objectivity. I think objectivity has come under a lot of scrutiny today about whether it exists or not. But I think we get closer to objectivity when we can be transparent and open about the process that leads us to these endpoints, because then we can examine fairly all the stuff that went into it and account for biases, influences, those other kinds of things.
One of the things that we might want to talk about a little bit here is question the very notion of objectivity. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Paul particularly, to correct me if I'm wrong. But my sense is that it's increasingly the case among those who look at ways of knowing, epistemology and the science of knowledge, increasingly the case that they're rejecting the notion of pure objectivity. With quantum mechanics, and Paul, you correct me if I'm wrong here, my sense is that with the development of quantum mechanics, there is a sense that the very act of observation affects the object being observed, so that the object cannot be known as pure object. It's already affected, modified in the act of observation, which is the act of a subject upon what we would traditionally have understood to be the object. So the quest for pure objectivity then is increasingly seen as an impossible quest, that it cannot be accomplished. Is that right, Paul?
I'll preface by saying I'm not a physicist, so quantum physics is probably not the place I want to delve too deeply. But I think it's important when you talk about quantum physics, it's not, at least I would say, it's not that there's no objectivity, it's just there's no precision in our measure. And so we can predict or we can make some probability statements about the state of an object that we're attempting to measure. We just can't measure it with any precision. And so it's not a bias. And so I'd say it's not a biased loss of objectivity. It's just a loss of precision in that example.
But Paul, isn't it more, I mean, isn't it more than, I think what Ron is saying, isn't it more than simply loss of precision? Because it's the very act of trying to measure it changes what's being measured. And so in that sense, there's no objective knowing, because the very act of knowing changes what we're trying to know in some way. And I mean, there is always going to be a subjective dimension. Now, we're probably getting way too heady on this conversation, so let's bring it back to...
I was going to ask if anybody in the class wanted to save us from this rarefied air.
I'll point out one...
Yes, good, a savior, right, okay.
Ron was saying, oh dear, this whole series has been about knowing, and you all have talked about the use of words, essentially, in knowing, whatever the field was, creative literature, science, philosophy. I know some things, and Don mentioned the Grieg Concerto by the Symphony over the weekend. I know beauty because of that. You can't put that under words. There is visual art that you respond to. Your heart says, oh my God, that's gorgeous. You have no idea why. Obviously, you hear music. You watch dance, and your heart soars with the dancer. And there is a knowledge there. Okay, talk about that.
Okay, well, I think what you're talking about, what you're referring to, Pat, is the evocative character of different kinds of experiences, and how they evoke from us responses, realized potentials that we would not otherwise have been able to even experience. Without song, without the birds, let's say that the first songsters, singers in human experience, there's no capacity for human musicality, for the potential for musicality. Marx talks about the extent to which, for a starving person, there's no capacity to distinguish between the taste of different things. It's just food. But there's a history of taste. When do we realize that we have the capacity to appreciate the taste of something pungent? When something pungent is created, and that evokes from us this, realizes this potential within us. And I think that's part of what I hear you saying when you're talking about music. If you didn't hear the music, you wouldn't know you had the capacity to respond to that music.
Know anything ahead of time to respond. I remember responding to my dad singing to me when I was a tiny child. And I'm very emotional about it. I didn't know from music.
You didn't know the music, but you learned something about yourself when you responded to that music. You learned that you were capable of being moved in this way or another way.
Good.
Jeff had a...
Who's up there?
Well, I don't need the microphone.
Okay.
I'll try to talk loudly. I've always been kind of in awe of quantum mechanics and uncertainty, but I've always understood it explained in that way to only occur on the subatomic level. And I was when the comments were being made about that, Ron's comments about Freud brought me back to, I believe he's once quoted as saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. We don't need to talk about its uncertainty or the quantum mechanics of a cigar, because that is the real world that we experience. It's probably more productive to take up with the cigar as a cigar than as a subject of quantum mechanics.
He wasn't talking about the distinction was not between the cigar as a cigar and the cigar as quantum mechanics. It was a phallic symbol or a cigar, right? That's what. That's the distinction he was working with.
Anybody else? Another question, comment here? Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
I don't want us to leave this discussion of perhaps the song, and because I'd really like to talk for a moment about knowing in different states, maybe in a transcendental, perhaps in kind of a William James sort of way, various shades of consciousness, perhaps knowing in dream, and without reducing them to a discussion of them, talking about them in terms of other kinds of knowing, sort of recognizing them as having their own status.
Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, but we did teach William James the first time we taught together, and mysticism as a way of knowing, and I think we moved away from that, which is, I think, a sense of loss, because there is something about that way of knowing for people who've experienced it, who oftentimes say it far surpasses or exceeds any other way of knowing that they have in their life, and it becomes the anchoring point for it. We do it a little bit by reading Black Elk Speaks, because Black Elk Speaks has this great vision when he's 9 years old, and it becomes the anchoring point for his life, in which it orients everything else. But it also kind of shatters the categories that we've even been talking about there. And I think great music, great art, these other things that we can't reduce into words or articulate in the same way, and yet they in some ways produce a certainty in us that far exceeds virtually anything else. And we can deal with it sometimes when we start talking about knowing the sacred, because oftentimes people refer to it, whether they refer specifically to God or the sacred, or simply it's an experience that they would define as so overwhelmingly powerful or beautiful or awe-inspiring. There's a dimension of the sacred in there. But it does, I would agree with you. I mean, I think for people who experience it, oftentimes becomes the most powerful way of knowing that orients everything else.
I'd like to follow up on that, because someone asked me a question that Linda gave me. For Gary Hawk, I wish it had gone to somebody else. As you study Job, what inspires you to believe that there is a God who cares about men? There is much about Job that inspires me. First, I'd like to say that I'm quite certain that God is concerned about women. It's men I'm not sure about. In response to this larger philosophical issue that Dan and this member of the audience is addressing, last night, thinking about this question, I couldn't sleep. And so I got up at midnight and I went to my Bible, and I was trying to recall that passage in the Epistle to the Hebrews where the author says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And so what I want to hold out for, and I'm going to contradict this in a moment, is the possibility of a faith position that is not dependent on sensory experience. Now, to contradict that, I also want to say that faith, I'm not going to talk about God right now, that faith may be informed by sensory experience. And to make that point, what I want to do is read a poem by Jane Kenyon called Depression in Winter. And I want to read this because it illustrates how a poet is using her sensory experience to help shape her faith convictions, and I want to read it in the light of this question, because I think that we include poetry, because poetry, as much as any art form, is a raid on the inarticulate. And I think we have a responsibility, ourselves as teachers, to make that raid on the inarticulate. And I demand that of my students. I have almost no tolerance for unsubstantiated opinion. And I'm probably the softest guy up here. I want them to tell me why they think what they think. And poets are masters at this raid on the inarticulate. Depression in winter. There comes a little space between the south side of a boulder and the snow that fills the woods around it. Sun heats the stone, reveals a crescent of bare ground, brown ferns, and tufts of needles like red hair. Acorns, a patch of moss, bright green. I sank with every step up to my knees, throwing myself forward with a violence of effort, greedy for unhappiness, until by accident I found the stone, with its secret porch of heat and light, where something small could luxuriate, then turned back down my path, chastened and calm. Now she's calm because after struggling through this sea of snow, she comes to this little refuge on the warm boulder. But she's chastened because she realizes, oh my God, I've forgotten that life can sometimes be gracious to me in my depression. And so she's chastened in that realization, having forgotten the way life can support us and sustain us. So here she's informed by her sensory experience, and that ratifies her faith. One of the things that I've been thinking about, or was thinking about last night at midnight, was that ultimately the proof of our faith will be in the life we live. And while we certainly read things that challenge faith, I am quite certain that the mystery that faith is trying to get at is not going to go away, no matter how many times Freud and others remind us that God is merely a projection of the Father on the screen of the universe, no matter how many times Richard Dawkins and others tell us that God is a delusion. The mystery laughs at that and knows that it will not go away. And that is both propositional and, for people of faith, rooted actually in sensory experience.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Gary. Anybody else want to add anything here? Question? Response?
I do not want that to be the last word.
Why not? Pretty good.
I wanted to say something about, and I have to ask Ron about this. When I taught in the Ways of Knowing course for the first time last fall, Ron and I team taught together. And the first paper assignment, we asked the students something like, what do you know and how do you know it? Can you imagine the papers? It was that pretty much it? And
Well, it was actually because we have these four ways of knowing. How do you know nature? And how do you think you understand that? Self, society, and what's the other one? The divine, the sacred. And then what do you take as authoritative in terms of what you think you know about each of these areas? And we, at the end of the semester, we invite them to revisit that.
well, that's what I wanted to speak to. I might have asked my section a somewhat different version, a horrible version, which is what do you know, how do you know it? And the answers were chaotic, and the writing, you can imagine the quality of the writing, because people don't write well when they don't know what they're writing about. But by the end of the semester, the point I wanted to make is the papers were remarkably different, and students had come to conclusions about what they know and why they know it, and not just in an objective kind of way, but they could connect it to aspects of their own lived experience. And it produced, I thought, quite wonderful papers. And the punctuation improved, too. So,
That's always reassuring, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Yes, that's right. But not the apostrophes, I bet.
well, not the
No, no.
semicolon. That's the one that
Not
gets them.
the semicolon or the apostrophe. Those are going the way of the dinosaur, I'm afraid. Okay, yeah, somebody over here. Jim?
Yes, I want to follow up that fine comment and come back to the woman here with whom I sympathize when she said, I'm not sure I know anything. Everything changes. And I think about the authoritative source, the Missoulian, which I read every morning, and I read the letters to the editor as kind of, I don't know, self-flagellation, I guess. You recognize that people interpret the world very differently, but they seem quite sure about what they are saying. And I realize that perhaps there's something to do with how we have learned and what we have experienced as to how it is that we interpret the world. I suppose that if you grew up in a spaceship, you wouldn't fall off your bike and not be so sure about gravity. Or if I was on top of Lolo Peak, the sun might rise at 6:45. So I'm wondering, if we're all so sure about what we know, what's the role of experience? Is it something that is significant to our ability to interpret the world?
Since I was a Darwinian here, I just say in a very basic level, experiences teach us to avoid pain, to avoid those things that would cause hunger, would cause discomfort. Since we're all social beings, I think experience, for those of us who can tap into human nature, avoid those things that harm others, and experience kind of tells us what to do and what to avoid. You can't ratchet this up to maybe talk about whether God exists or not. Experience at that level of I don't know if Gary would want to say abstraction. Maybe that's not quite the right word. Then people's differences and their varied dispositions become very, very active, and in realms of politics or ideology or so forth. But I just wanted to point to those kind of basic things that wow, fire hurts. I don't think I'll do that again. So.
I think that one of the things that we probably all want our students to do when we talk about critical thinking, and everybody at the university says we teach critical thinking, and there's supposed to be ways of doing that and measuring it and so on. One of the things I notice with students is that they tend to, if they think critical thinking, they usually think about tearing something down, looking at a text and saying, oh, I don't like it because such and such. And one of the things that I think is really important is in critical thinking has to do with the students recognizing how much his or her experience shapes what he or she knows. I think our experience does shape it, but to live within your own experience without realizing that your experience shapes what you know or think you know is to be uncritical, I think. And I'm also convinced, when we look at science, the questions that scientists ask are determined by their own experience. I think that's why questions arise, is because of our own experience. We begin to look in completely different areas of scientific research or academic research, literary research, and to ask different questions depending on our own experience. Somebody who was here, I don't know if she's here today, but when Ron was talking, was mentioning to Ron the story that Thales fell into a well or something. Remember, he was one of those old Greek philosophers who was kind of looking around for, what's the original unitary something from which everything came? And he fell into a well, and he said, it's water. And that seems like an example. It's probably apocryphal, but it would be perfectly sensible for somebody who had this experience to know on the basis of that experience, I think, or to begin to think on the basis of that experience. Does that make any sense
Yes,
at
it
all?
does.
Or
And what's important there is that initiates a dialogue. We haven't talked enough about that, I don't think. Anaximander comes along and says, no, it can't be just water. There's conflict. So there's got to be, water is opposed by fire, so there must be conflict. And then someone else comes along and says, well, let me pick up the conversation. I'm thinking about what you've said. That's not adequate either. I want to develop that a bit more. So there's a dialogical character to this process of reasoning that I didn't emphasize enough when I was talking about reason as a verb, reason as a process. It's one thing to initiate the discussion about what is distinctive about the moral life. And someone can come along and say, well, there must be free will. You don't hold someone morally accountable unless they were free to do something else. They had a choice. But that doesn't end the discussion. People pick up on that and say, okay, now I want to develop that a bit more. Still searching for what is distinctive about that particular experience. Now, what the pre-Socratics were after, of course, was what is the universal substance of reality, of being. But in every instance, there's a kind of dialogical character, it seems to me, or almost every instance, there's a dialogical character to this rational process. Someone mentioned peer review and the importance of peer review. It's not, if Einstein had sort of come up with the theory of relativity and said, I think I'll keep it to myself. Right? I know, nobody else is going to know. No, he has to make that public. He has to put that out there for others to respond to. And it's only then that it acquires some kind of status, that it becomes validated by the response of others or through the response of others. The problem with so many of the letters to the Missoulian, not all, because I write some of them, is that I look at them and they're self-validating. So someone will say, there's no global warming because I read about a great flood 2,000 years ago. And so if there was a great flood 2,000 years ago, don't tell me there's global warming and we're going to have a flood. We've already had floods. So there's nothing new going on. That's a kind of self-validating
What's wrong with
process.
That? What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that? Ask the scientist. There's a mountain of evidence for global warming. He's selecting one piece of that evidence and saying there was a precedent for that particular piece of evidence. Therefore, I'm going to deny the rest of the evidence, the mountain of evidence. Go ahead.
Kitty.
Well, I'm just wondering, I'm trying to think of these students in this class. And I think like discourse, disagreement, and doubt in conversation in the United States right now isn't handled very well. We don't do well with people who disagree with us or people who are set up as our leaders. The big thing is they come up with an answer that nobody should ever disagree with. So these students come out of that culture. How do you work with them in these classes to get them to listen to each other, converse with one another? I'd like to know, because I think it'd be good for all of us. How do you work with that doubt and disagreement?
I think, first of all, we allow it. We even encourage it. So, and the students are wonderful at challenging each other. If one person says A, somebody else is going to say B, and somebody else is going to say C. So that's part of the dialectic that Ron's talking about. You have to have an atmosphere that embraces that sort of interchange. So I think it just happens unless, you've got a teacher there who thinks he knows the answer or she knows the answer and wants to dominate.
May I just add something to that? Because I do find that I don't know if I have to say this to students, but I usually do at the beginning of a class, at the beginning of a semester. If I think there's going to be dialogue that might get really heated or might get really nasty or might hurt people, I just have to say to them, you know, we're going to discuss amongst ourselves. We won't all agree with each other. I can imagine that with two of these guys up in front of the class, it's going to be clear that we don't all agree with each other. But we will talk to each other with respect. We are going to keep a certain level of civil discourse, because that's the way we have to live in the outside world, and that's the way you have to live here, unless somebody is going to feel silenced in the room. So I really find that students are pretty quick to say, oh, here's what I think, here's what they, but they can be pretty cruel about how they say it to each other. And I think there's too much of that going on in the public sphere now. So I really do feel that I have to say to them, you know, there's a way that you discuss things on which people are going to disagree and disagree pretty strongly. So let's just make sure that we keep a certain level of respect for each other in the classroom. And it doesn't always work, and sometimes people would just sit there and not say anything. But I do think it can get, you know, can get nasty and hurtful, and I don't want that to happen, because then people do clam up. So, yeah, Dan.
If I could follow up on that thing, then I want to, one of the things that you made me think about, Kitty, but I always try to really work with my students a couple things. I say, let's have our passion and engagement be with the ideas and the arguments, not with the people who are expressing them, so that what we really want to do is get these ideas out there. And so even if somebody who puts something out that you don't really like at all, they've actually contributed helpfully if they put the ideas out there, but then we engage the ideas and not attack the people on that. The other thing, and I think a lot of us try and do this both consciously and unconsciously, but I try to make this strategy and to model it, and that is to always give the most sympathetic reading to a text as the initial reading. And then once we really try to understand it on its own terms and its own context as sympathetically as possible, then we can examine it critically. But I think when we develop that habit with each other, it's also very, very helpful. If you can try, even though you intensely dislike a person or what they're advocating, to try to give the most sympathetic listening to it as the initial listening, and say, okay, what's the merit in it? Why does this person care about it? What in their experience has made this an important thing? How can I, have my own position informed by that initially? That leads to a much more civil basis of dialogue than to immediate, and I think this is what I think Linda's exactly right. Our students hear critical thinking as criticizing. And what I try to say again, critical thinking is a deeper engagement. And a deeper engagement oftentimes starts from a position of respect, not from dismissal. So that we really, you try to engage more deeply by listening thoughtfully and carefully, deeply as your initial stance on that. So we do try to model that. We have a lot of fun and we engage each other, but I think when students can sense it comes out of respect. That's really important. The only other thing I want to say here, and this is where I always feel so badly for kindergarten teachers, because we get these ways of knowing students in their first semester in college, and oftentimes I don't see them again afterwards. And first semester in college, if you're familiar with Perry's models of development, things like that, but oftentimes students coming right out of high school have a tendency to see the world very much in black and white, either or kind of thing. And part of what I see us doing in ways of knowing is giving them the skills to start moving into seeing the gray in there. But right now, I'm doing a senior honors thesis with a young woman who I had in my very first Ways of Knowing class 5 years ago. It is so delightful to remember where she was 5 years ago and see where she is now. And so I always keep present for me as the parable of the sower in the New Testament, because I really see myself as an instructor. I'm sowing seeds. I can't control which ones are going to sprout where, when, and what time. What I can do is try to prepare the soil and prepare the seeds for that thoughtfully with all these other little skills like that. But then you really have to leave it to the students and trust that other circumstances and their own things are going to allow it to nurture. But it's particularly joyful when you get to meet these students later on and see what they've done with that.
It's about 8:15. You've used a couple of words in the past half minute or so, which I want to ask all of you about. You said it was delightful to see the progress of the student, and it's particularly joyful to be able to interact with students in that way. I wonder if anybody wants to say anything about what kind of joy or delight you find in this particular class. That's maybe already been said or hasn't been said, and let's do it, unfortunately, sort of briefly, so that we can get to the wine and the cheese. And if we didn't answer your question, please just corner one of these people or all of them at the wine and cheese and ask. Okay, anybody want to just tell us your delight, Gary?
One of my great delights as a teacher in the Ways of Knowing program is having the opportunity to teach with these and other people. There's no way for us to be experts in all of these subjects or in all of these ways of knowing. And we're actually dependent on one another for our relative strengths. And I am deeply grateful that I have a chance to teach with these people.
I'll try to be brief. I love teaching in different circumstances, and so I love teaching the large general education course because I have everything from the student who's only there because he has to take it to the student who's there because she wants to try something new. And I love teaching graduate students because they've focused on anything like that. The Ways of Knowing course, one of the things I love about it, these are really bright students. They just get them. You get them their first semester in college. Many of them, Missoula is the biggest town they've ever lived in. They're new, they're fresh, and they're really exciting. And it's just a great time to be in that particular kind of class.
I think mine's pretty much the same as Dan's. At my age, it's just a delight to be able to work with young people. And what I'm impressed with about them, perhaps more than anything else, is that in most instances, they are so candid, they are so willing to expose themselves and their thoughts and their beliefs to others, to go public with that. And that's an incredibly refreshing and delightful feature of the course, as is working with my colleagues.
I guess one thing that comes to my mind is the enjoyment I get when students enjoy the life of the mind, when ideas are passionate and interesting and people light up and, wow, this is what I've come to college for, apart from any practical application or how I'm going to pay off my enormous college debt or all those real-world concerns, just that energy and that enthusiasm in exchanging ideas. So that's a lovely thing to be involved in.
Wow, it's bad to go last. I guess the one thing that I'll say about this course that I really, really enjoy is, unlike most of the other courses I teach, we do engage the students a lot and we allow them to be a bit creative. And so one of the other classes I teach is genetics and evolution, and if I ask what the probability that a pea is going to be green, there is a right answer and a wrong answer. In Ways of Knowing, there are certainly wrong answers, and we get those from time to time, but there are a wide diversity of right answers. And the class really lets me be a little more creative than I can in other classes, and I really enjoy that. And it's like we're having a love fest up here, but we all have really good time teaching together. So.
Could I ask you, is this a unique course at our honors college, or are lots of schools doing it?
Oh, good question. And the dean isn't here. I don't really know. Does anybody who's been in this since the beginning know how this arose? It started when Jerry Fetz was the dean, didn't it?
Sure.
And,
I think Bob Pack started it.
Sean O'Brien and Bob
Yeah.
Pack worked together on it, and so the course is homegrown out of the Davidson Honors College. There are similar courses that are taught dialogically and things elsewhere, but this course designed, team-taught, focus on 4 areas: ways of knowing the sacred, self, society, and the world, and approach of literature, science, philosophy, things like that is pretty distinctive, if not unique. Lori?
The International Baccalaureate program, which many students take for high school, approaches from the Blinkian perspective. Rather than dividing by what you're going to know, it's even more focused on how you know. And so a lot of students are coming in high school with that kind of preparation.
I didn't hear all that. What?
I can't.
Lori was saying that the International Baccalaureate, which is a kind of certification that high school students can get now, in the International Baccalaureate program, they come in having dealt with the Blakean idea of different ways of knowing, right? Emotional, sensory, and so on and so forth. So she was saying that this is elsewhere, but I think that this course really was intrinsic to our honors college. And I suspect that Bob Pack was the real kind of prime mover of this, because he just teaches everything. He's just quite the Renaissance man. So I suspect he was the moving spirit there. Okay, well, it's been a delight to be with all of you for these 6 weeks. Thanks. Come on down the hallway and have some wine and cheese.
Thank you so much for moderating.
Ethics and
Oh,
ethics
God.
based
Fun for me. I've just had a great
I want to be
time.
able to use
Those experiences I don't forget.